Hey everyone! Tonight we're traveling to China, specifically to the folklore of the Qing Dynasty, where the dead didn't always stay buried, and morticians had one of the strangest jobs in human history. This is the story of the Jiangshi, the hopping vampire corpse that terrorized villages, drained life force from the living, and somehow became both genuinely terrifying and objectively ridiculous at the same time. Before we begin, go ahead and like this video and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? And have you ever heard of the Jiangshi before tonight? If you're from China or have Chinese heritage, did your grandparents tell you stories about the hopping corpses? Did they warn you about proper burial rites? Have you seen the old Hong Kong films that turned this monster into a cultural icon? I'd love to hear your stories. Now settle in, maybe turn on some ambient sounds, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture a corpse. Qing Dynasty official robes, arms stretched straight out, legs locked at the knees. It's moving toward you, but not walking. Hopping. Stiff, mechanical hops, like someone tied its ankles together. There's a yellow paper talisman stuck to its forehead, covering its eyes. It can't see you, but it knows you're there because it can sense your breath. You hold perfectly still. The corpse hops closer. Closer. You can smell the decay now. See the green-tinged skin, the fingernails that have kept growing, a mouth frozen in a grimace. And then you remember. You're holding a bag of rice. Glutinous rice. The kind you'd normally eat with dinner. You throw a handful at the corpse. It recoils like you've thrown acid. The rice grains stick to its rotten flesh, burning it, forcing it back. Your survival depends on whether you packed lunch. Specifically, sticky rice. Welcome to Chinese folklore, where the monsters have very particular weaknesses and morticians doubled as paranormal pest control. The Jiangshi isn't like Western vampires. There's no seduction, no transformation into bats, no romantic brooding in castles. The Jiangshi is a reanimated corpse that hops because rigor mortis locked its joints, drains your key life force instead of blood, and is controlled by Taoist magic involving paper spells, chicken blood, and surprisingly specific rituals. It's both more grounded than Western vampires. Actual corpses, actual decay, actual mortuary practices, and somehow more bizarre. Because when you really think about it, a hopping vampire that's defeated by rice sounds like someone made it up as a joke. Except people genuinely believed in this, feared it, organized entire professions around dealing with it. The Jiangshi wasn't entertainment. It was a legitimate concern for anyone who died far from home during the Qing Dynasty. Once you understand the context, the corpse transportation industry, the beliefs about key and proper burial, the very real problem of bodies decomposing during long journeys, the Jiangshi starts making a disturbing amount of sense. So let's talk about how a hopping corpse with paper on its face became one of China's most enduring monsters. To understand the Jiangshi, you first need to understand death in Qing Dynasty China. Dying wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a logistical problem, especially if you died far from your ancestral home. Chinese culture placed enormous importance on being buried in your home village, near your ancestors. Your spirit needed to rest with family. If you were buried in foreign soil, your soul would wander, lost and angry. This wasn't superstition and a sense of baseless fear. It was deeply embedded religious belief tied to ancestor worship, Confucian filial piety, and Taoist cosmology. So when someone died away from home, a merchant in a distant city, a laborer on a construction project, a soldier in a far province, the family faced a problem. They needed to bring the body back, sometimes hundreds of miles, through mountains, across rivers, in all weather conditions, without refrigeration, without modern embalming, just a corpse that would start rotting within days. This created an entire profession, corpse herders, professional morticians who specialized in transporting the dead back to their home villages. And this is where the Jiangshi legend intersects with very real historical practice. Because some of these corpse herders allegedly used a specific technique, they would perform Taoist rituals to reanimate the corpse, just enough to make it hop along the road at night, following the mortician like a grotesque puppet. The mortician would travel at night to avoid frightening villagers. He'd ring a bell to warn people to stay inside and close their windows. The corpses would hop single file behind him, guided by paper talismans stuck to their foreheads. Arms outstretched for balance. Legs locked from rigor mortis. Hopping. This sounds insane. And yet there are historical records of corpse transportation practices that align eerily well with Jiangshi folklore. Night travel. Bell warnings. Taoist rituals involving paper spells. Villages that refused to let corpse herders pass through during daylight. Whether corpses actually hopped is probably not the right question. Whether people believed corpses could be reanimated through Taoist magic and organized their entire mortuary industry around that belief is documented fact. The line between practical mortuary work and supernatural belief was essentially non-existent. If you were a corpse herder, you performed the rituals because that's how the job was done. Whether the magic worked or whether you were just moving corpses through psychological theater didn't particularly matter. The rituals made families feel better, kept villagers from panicking, and maintained the social fiction that everything was under control. And sometimes, according to the stories, the rituals failed. The talisman fell off. The corpse stopped following commands. The reanimated body retained just enough qi to become dangerous. No longer under control, but not quite dead either. That's when you had a Jiangshi problem. The Jiangshi's appearance is very specific, and every detail connects to actual corpse decay and Qing Dynasty burial practices. First, the Qing Dynasty official robes. These weren't just any clothes. They were formal garments, often the best outfit a person owned. Families dressed their dead in these robes for burial as a mark of respect and status. So a corpse reanimating would logically be wearing whatever it was buried in. The robes also served a practical function in the legend. They were stiff, formal garments that restricted movement, which helped explain why the Jiangshi moved awkwardly. The clothing itself became part of the horror. You could identify a Jiangshi from a distance just by seeing those distinctive robes hopping through the darkness. The arms stretched straight out in front is both practical and symbolic. Practically, rigor mortis does lock joints. Bodies become stiff within hours of death. Arms might naturally extend forward, depending on how the body was positioned. Symbolically, the outstretched arms are perfect for horror. The corpse is reaching for you, always reaching, even though it can't see. The hopping movement is the most distinctive feature. It comes from rigor mortis locking the leg joints, making normal walking impossible. The corpse can only move by hopping stiffly, both feet together, like a person in a sack race. This should be comical. A hopping monster sounds ridiculous. But imagine actually seeing it. A corpse in formal robes hopping toward you in the dark. The movement is wrong, unnatural. The sound of its feet hitting the ground in perfect rhythm. Thud, thud, getting closer. You can't run quietly, and running makes noise, which helps it track you because it can't see, but it can hear. The hopping movement becomes genuinely unsettling once you picture it in context. It's slow but relentless, predictable but unavoidable. And there's something deeply disturbing about a corpse that moves in such an inhuman way. The yellow paper talisman on the forehead is the control mechanism. These weren't random decorations. They were actual Taoist magic seals used in funeral rites and exorcisms. The paper had specific characters written in chicken blood or cinnabar ink, invoking spiritual authority to control the corpse. As long as the talisman stayed in place, the corpse remained under the mortician's control. If it fell off due to rain, wind, or decay, the corpse would wake up fully, no longer bound by the spell. And since the talisman covered the corpse's eyes, Removing it meant the Jiangshi could suddenly sense its surroundings more effectively. The inability to see is a crucial detail. The Jiangshi doesn't hunt by sight. It senses your breath, your qi, the living energy you emit. This means hiding doesn't work. Staying still might work if you can genuinely hold your breath long enough. But most people can't. Eventually, you breathe, and the Jiangshi knows exactly where you are. The physical appearance of the corpse itself reflects actual decomposition. Green-tinged skin from decay, fingernails and hair that appear longer because the flesh has receded, a stiff, grimacing expression because facial muscles contract after death. The smell of rot, unavoidable and overwhelming. The Jiangshi is horror rooted in the reality of death. It's not a supernatural entity from another realm. It's a corpse that didn't stay dead, and that makes it worse somehow. More visceral, more immediate. You're not fighting a demon. You're fighting a body that should be buried but isn't. And everything about it, the stiffness, the smell, the wrong movement, reminds you that death is supposed to be final, but sometimes isn't. The Jiangshi doesn't drink blood. It drains qi, your life force, the energy that keeps you alive. This distinction matters because it connects the monster to Chinese cosmology in ways Western vampires don't. In Taoist and traditional Chinese medicine, qi is fundamental. It's the vital energy flowing through all living things. When your qi is strong, you're healthy. When it's weak, you get sick. When it's gone, you die. A Jiangshi is a body with just enough residual qi to remain animated, but not enough to truly live. It exists in a liminal state between life and death, sustained by draining qi from others. It's not evil in a moral sense. It's desperate, hungry, driven by an instinctive need to replenish what it's lost. The mechanics of qi draining vary by story, but the most common version involves the Jiangshi grabbing you with its outstretched arms and holding on while it absorbs your life force. You don't bleed. You don't get bitten. You just feel your energy draining away, leaving you weak, cold, exhausted. Victims describe feeling like their warmth is being pulled out through their skin, like something invisible is hollowing them out from the inside. They become pale, lethargic, unable to move. If the Jiangshi drains enough qi, the victim dies. Not from blood loss or physical injury, but simply from having their life force consumed. This creates a different kind of horror than blood-drinking vampires. There's no dramatic bite mark, no torn throat, just a corpse that looks peaceful, but is empty, drained of whatever made it alive. And here's the worst part. Victims who lose too much qi, but don't die, immediately become weak, sickly, prone to possession or reanimation themselves. The Jiangshi's touch doesn't just harm you. It makes you more vulnerable to becoming one. Some stories suggest that people killed by a Jiangshi have a higher chance of becoming Jiangshi themselves, creating a cycle of reanimation. One corpse escapes control, drains several people. Those people die and reanimate, and suddenly a village has an outbreak. The qi draining mechanic also explains why certain protections work. Items that preserve or purify qi, glutinous rice, peachwood, chicken blood, can disrupt the Jiangshi's ability to absorb life force. They don't kill it, but they create barriers it can't cross or substances it can't tolerate. Your survival against the Jiangshi isn't about physical strength. It's about maintaining your qi, keeping it protected, preventing the monster from latching onto you long enough to drain it away. Which brings us to the defenses. And this is where Chinese folklore gets extremely specific and slightly absurd. Let's talk about glutinous rice, sticky rice, the same stuff you eat with mango or use in dumplings. According to Jiangshi folklore, this rice is one of the most effective weapons against the hopping dead. Throw it at a Jiangshi, and the rice grains stick to its rotting flesh and burn like acid. Scatter it across your doorway, and the Jiangshi can't cross. Carry a pouch of it, and you have emergency defense. Why rice? The explanations vary, but the most common relates to purity and life energy. Rice is a cultivated grain, grown with human labor, representing civilization and vitality. Glutinous rice specifically has a sticky quality that, in folk belief, allows it to trap negative energy or corrupt qi. From a practical standpoint, rice was abundant, cheap, and easy to carry. If you're creating a folk defense against monsters, picking something everyone already has makes sense. But the cultural symbolism runs deeper. Rice is life-sustaining, the opposite of death and decay. Using it against corpses creates a symbolic confrontation between life and death. Still, your monster hunting kit includes a bag of rice, not a sword. Not holy water, rice, the same thing you had for lunch. Peachwood is another critical defense. Swords, stakes, or branches made from peach trees are said to have spiritual power against the undead. Taoist priests carry peachwood swords specifically for exorcisms and fighting Jiangshi. Peach trees in Chinese culture are associated with longevity, immortality, and protection against evil. The wood itself is considered spiritually pure. A peachwood sword doesn't need to be sharp. It's not a physical weapon. It's a spiritual tool that disrupts the Jiangshi's qi, breaking the reanimation magic and forcing the corpse to collapse. Again, practical note. Peachwood was common and easy to carve. Every village had peach trees. Creating a defense system based on accessible materials makes folklore functional. Chicken blood, particularly blood from a black rooster, is used in Taoist rituals to write the talismans that control Jiangshi. It's also used as a protective barrier, painted across doorways, and the Jiangshi can't enter. Why chicken blood? Chickens are associated with yang energy, daylight, life, warmth. Black roosters specifically are considered especially potent because they embody concentrated yang. Using their blood in rituals channels that life energy against the death energy of the Jiangshi. Mirrors are effective because the Jiangshi can't see its own reflection. Some stories claim mirrors trap the Jiangshi's attention, confusing it. Others say mirrors reflect the monster's corrupt qi back at itself, causing pain or disorientation. This connects to broader Chinese beliefs about mirrors as spiritual tools. Mirrors don't just reflect light. They reflect truth, revealing hidden things. A Jiangshi confronted by a mirror is forced to see what it truly is. A dead thing that should be buried. Holding your breath is one of the stranger defenses, but makes sense within the monster's mechanics. The Jiangshi senses your breath, your qi flowing in and out of your body. If you can stop breathing temporarily, you become invisible to it. Of course, humans need to breathe. So this defense is temporary at best. Hold your breath while the Jiangshi hops past. Pray it doesn't linger. Exhale slowly once it's gone. Survival by suffocation is a deeply uncomfortable strategy. Garlic doesn't work, by the way. That's a Western vampire thing. Throwing garlic at a Jiangshi does nothing except waste food and make you smell like you're preparing dinner. The defenses against Jiangshi are a fascinating mix of spiritual belief, practical accessibility, and symbolic logic. They're not random. Each one connects to Chinese cosmology, agricultural life, or Taoist practice. But they're also kind of absurd when listed together. Your survival kit against the hopping undead. Rice, peach tree branches, chicken blood, a mirror, and the ability to hold your breath. Good luck explaining that to anyone who wasn't there. Now let's talk about the Taoist priests, because they're the actual professionals in this scenario. While villagers panic and throw rice, Taoist priests are the ones who genuinely know what they're doing. These weren't just religious figures. They were specialists, exorcists, ritualists, spiritual engineers who understood the mechanics of qi, reanimation, and corpse control. When a Jiangshi appeared, you didn't call the local militia. You called a Taoist priest. Their training was extensive, learning to read and write the complex talismanic characters. memorizing rituals passed down through generations, understanding which herbs, woods, and substances affected spiritual energy, knowing how to diagnose whether a corpse was merely dead or dangerously reanimated. The priest's primary tool was the paper talisman. These weren't generic spells. Each talisman was custom written for specific situations. Controlling a corpse during transport required different characters than subduing a rogue Jiangshi. The ink mattered, chicken blood, or cinnabar. The paper quality mattered. The calligraphy had to be perfect. A single wrong stroke could render the talisman useless. Writing a talisman was both art and science. Too weak, and a Jiangshi wouldn't respond. Too strong, and you risked binding the corpse too tightly, potentially trapping the spirit in a way that created worse problems later. The peachwood sword was their physical weapon, but it wasn't used like a regular sword. You didn't slash at the Jiangshi. You performed ritual strikes, specific movements accompanied by chanted incantations. The sword disrupted the Jiangshi's key field, breaking the reanimation magic holding it together. A skilled priest could disable a Jiangshi with a single strike, the peachwood touching the right point on the corpse's body and severing its connection to residual ki. The corpse would simply collapse, truly dead again. Bells were crucial for detection and control. The brass bell's ring had spiritual properties. It could alert villagers to danger, disrupt the Jiangshi's concentration, or even temporarily stun it. Priests rang bells while tracking Jiangshi, using the sound to confuse the monster's key-sensing ability. The ritual itself, subduing a Jiangshi, involved multiple steps. First, confirmation that you're actually dealing with a Jiangshi, and not just a very sick person or someone sleepwalking in strange clothes. Second, containment, using talismans and barriers to prevent the Jiangshi from escaping. Third, binding, applying a control talisman to the forehead. Fourth, returning the corpse to proper rest through burial rites. If the Jiangshi was too dangerous or too far gone, the priest might perform a destruction ritual, using fire, blessed substances, or spiritual techniques to completely disperse the corpse's residual ki, ensuring it could never reanimate again. The work was dangerous. A Jiangshi could drain a priest's ki just as easily as anyone else's. Priests protected themselves through meditation, maintaining strong personal ki, and wearing protective amulets. But mistakes happened. Talismans fell off. Rituals failed. Priests died. Successful Taoist priests were respected and well compensated. They traveled between villages, offering services, training apprentices, and maintaining the spiritual health of communities. They were part of the social infrastructure, as essential as doctors or magistrates, and they took their work seriously. A rogue Jiangshi wasn't just a supernatural threat. It was a failure of proper death rites, a disruption of cosmic balance, and a genuine danger to human life. The priests saw themselves as maintaining order between the living and the dead. Their expertise turned Jiangshi from unstoppable horror into manageable problem. Terrifying, yes. Deadly, absolutely. But solvable if you had the right training, tools, and talismans. The villages relied on them, and the priests, for their part, kept doing the work, one hopping corpse at a time. The Jiangshi's existence is tied directly to beliefs about proper burial and the treatment of the dead. In Chinese culture, death isn't an ending. It's a transition. The spirit continues, and how you handle the body determines whether that spirit rests peacefully or becomes dangerous. Proper burial required several elements. First, the body had to be returned to ancestral land. Second, specific rites had to be performed at the correct times. Third, the family had to maintain the grave and perform regular ancestor worship. When any of these elements failed, body buried far from home, rites performed incorrectly, grave neglected, the spirit became restless. And a restless spirit could reanimate the body, creating a Jiangshi. Violent deaths were particularly dangerous. Someone who died in anger, fear, or pain carried that emotional energy into death. Their qi remained turbulent, making reanimation more likely. Murder victims, people who died in accidents, soldiers killed in battle, all were at higher risk of becoming Jiangshi. Drowning deaths were especially problematic because water was believed to trap qi. A body pulled from water retained chaotic, waterlogged qi that resisted proper dispersal. These corpses required extra rituals and were watched carefully during funeral preparations. Suicide created its own complications. The act of taking one's own life was seen as deeply unnatural, a violation of the cosmic order. The qi of a suicide victim was corrupted by that final act of will, twisted in ways that made the spirit angry and the body prone to reanimation. Bodies left unburied for too long were also at risk. Every day a corpse remained above ground. Its qi degraded further. It drifted closer to becoming something other than dead. If too much time passed, the line between corpse awaiting burial and corpse that might wake up became dangerously thin. This created enormous pressure on families to handle death quickly and correctly. Delay was dangerous. Mistakes were catastrophic. And if you were poor, far from home, or dealing with unusual circumstances, the risk multiplied. The corpse herding profession existed specifically to manage these risks. Families paid significant sums to have bodies transported properly, with all the right rituals, to ensure their loved ones didn't become monsters. But not everyone could afford proper transportation. Poor families, migrants, people who died without relatives nearby, their bodies might be buried wherever they fell, without the necessary rites, without ancestral connection. Those were the corpses that became Jiangshi, the forgotten dead, the improperly buried, the ones whose families couldn't afford to bring them home. The monster became a symbol of social inequality. If you were wealthy, your body was handled correctly. If you were poor, you might hop. There's something deeply sad about that. The Jiangshi isn't just a monster. It's a corpse that deserved better. A person who died far from home and never made it back. The horror comes from their continued suffering. Trapped in a rotting body, driven by instinct, unable to rest. And the living, faced with the Jiangshi, had to destroy what remained. No second burial. No proper rites. Just violence to stop the hopping. The original death wasn't the tragedy. The reanimation was. Proper burial wasn't just religious obligation. It was monster prevention. Take care of your dead, and they rest peacefully. Neglect them, and they come hopping back. Let's return to the corpse herders, because their work is where folklore and historical practice blur completely. These men, and they were almost always men, occupied a strange professional niche. Morticians, spiritual guides, and long-distance transporters all in one. When a family hired a corpse herder, they were buying expertise. The herder knew the roads, the safe places to rest, the villages that allowed corpse passage, and those that didn't. He knew the rituals necessary to keep a corpse from decomposing too quickly, and allegedly, the rituals to make a corpse move. The night travel made practical sense. Daytime roads were crowded. Merchants, farmers, officials, all traveling, all potential witnesses to corpse transportation. Most people didn't want to see dead bodies being moved. It was bad luck, inauspicious. Villagers would complain to local authorities if corpse herders traveled during the day. So the herders moved at night. They'd leave a village after sunset, travel until just before dawn, and rest in designated areas outside populated zones. They announced themselves with bells, specifically to warn people to stay inside, close shutters, and avoid accidentally encountering the dead. This bell warning became deeply embedded in folklore. The sound of a bell at night meant corpses were passing. Children were told to stay in bed. Adults knew not to look outside. The bell created a social agreement. The living stay inside, the dead pass through, and everyone pretends nothing is happening. The paper talismans served multiple functions. Religiously, They controlled the corpse's spirit. Practically, they covered the corpse's face, making the sight less disturbing if someone did accidentally glimpse the procession. Socially, they signaled that proper rites were being observed, that this was legitimate mortuary work rather than grave robbery or murder. The hopping movement, whether literal or metaphorical, made sense for corpses in rigor mortis. Bodies become stiff within hours of death. Arms and legs lock. Joints don't bend. Transporting a stiff body over rough terrain is difficult. Some corpse herders allegedly propped bodies upright and moved them in short, shuffling steps rather than carrying them horizontally. Whether corpses actually hopped, or whether this was an exaggerated description of how bodies were moved is, again, unclear. Historical records mention corpse herders. They mention night travel and bell warnings. They mention talismans. The hopping specifically appears primarily in folklore rather than official documentation. But the cultural belief was strong enough that people organized their lives around it. Villages had rules about corpse passage. Roads had designated rest stops. The profession was regulated, with herders requiring permission from local authorities. And sometimes things went wrong. A corpse herder might fall ill during a journey, leaving bodies unattended. Severe weather could delay travel, allowing corpses to decompose past the point of effective ritual control. Bandits might attack, stealing the herder's tools and leaving corpses abandoned. When a herder failed to complete a journey, for whatever reason, the corpses left behind became problems. No talisman control. No proper destination. Just bodies decomposing on the roadside, their key degrading into something dangerous. Villages near common corpse herding routes lived with constant low-level anxiety. Every abandoned body was a potential Jiangshi. Every delay in corpse passage meant risk. The herders themselves were respected but feared. They dealt with death daily. They knew rituals most people never learned. They walked roads at night that others avoided. Some were seen as spiritually polluted by their work. Necessary, but not someone you'd want at a wedding. Their profession declined in the early 20th century as transportation improved. Trains and motor vehicles made corpse transport faster and easier. Refrigeration allowed bodies to be moved without immediate decay. The ritualistic aspects faded as modernization replaced traditional practices. But the folklore remained. The image of the corpse herder ringing his bell, corpses hopping behind him in the dark, became iconic. It's one of the most enduring images of Chinese folklore. Practical mortuary work transformed into supernatural horror through cultural belief and storytelling. Whether it was ever truly real doesn't particularly matter. People believed it was real, and that belief shaped how they treated death, handled corpses, and understood the boundary between life and the undead. Now let's examine what happens when a Jiangshi appears in a village. Because the response wasn't just individual panic, it was organized community defense. The first sign was usually indirect. Livestock dying overnight with no visible wounds. Families waking up exhausted, drained, unable to explain why. Strange sounds. Rhythmic thumping, like someone hopping past houses in the dark. Then someone would see it. A corpse in Qing robes, hopping down a street, arms outstretched. The witness would run, shouting warnings. Bells would ring. Not the corpse herder's bell, but alarm bells calling people to action. The first priority was confirming the threat. Was this actually a Jiangshi, or just a sick person? A drunk, someone in costume? Village elders or the local Taoist priest would investigate, looking for specific signs. The hopping movement, the talisman on the forehead, the smell of decay, the key draining effect on nearby people. Once confirmed, containment began. Rice would be scattered across doorways. Peachwood branches hung above entrances. Families gathered indoors, keeping children away from windows. No one traveled alone. No one went out after dark. The Taoist priest, if the village had one, would prepare for confrontation. Writing talismans, blessing weapons, gathering the materials needed for ritual combat. If the village didn't have a priest, messengers would be sent to neighboring areas, begging for help. Meanwhile, the village's men would form watch groups. Not to fight the Jiangshi directly, that was suicide without proper training, but to track it, observe its patterns, and ensure it didn't enter homes. They carried torches, bells, mirrors, and bags of rice. Their job was deterrence and early warning, not combat. Women and elders prepared defenses, cooking large batches of glutinous rice, painting chicken blood across thresholds, teaching children the breath-holding technique and where to hide if the Jiangshi got inside. The community response was total. Every household contributed. Everyone knew their role. This wasn't optional participation. A Jiangshi threatened the entire village, and survival required collective effort. If the priest arrived, the dynamic shifted from defense to offense. The priest would track the Jiangshi to its lair, often an abandoned building, a cave, or the grave it had risen from. Then came the ritual confrontation. The priest approached with bell and sword, chanting protection sutras to strengthen his own ki. The Jiangshi would sense him immediately, a living human full of life force walking directly toward it. The encounter that followed was part spiritual combat, part physical struggle. The priest used the peachwood sword to disrupt the Jiangshi's ki field while avoiding its grasping arms. One touch from the corpse could start draining the priest's life force, weakening him, making the sword strikes less effective. The goal was to apply a control talisman to the Jiangshi's forehead, or, if that failed, to destroy it completely. Some priests used fire, burning the corpse until its ki dispersed. Others used blessed swords to dismember the body, separating the limbs so even if ki remained, the corpse couldn't move. Success meant the village could return to normal. The body would be properly buried, additional rituals performed to ensure it stayed down, and guards posted at the grave for several nights to confirm it didn't rise again. Failure meant casualties. A priest killed by a Jiangshi left the village defenseless. The monster would continue draining ki, potentially creating more Jiangshi from its victims, until eventually the entire community had to evacuate. Some villages were abandoned, specifically because of Jiangshi outbreaks. Too many deaths, too many reanimations, not enough priests to handle the problem. Survivors fled to neighboring areas, leaving behind empty homes and restless dead. The folklore served a function. It taught communities how to respond to death-related crises. Whether the threat was literal Jiangshi or the more mundane dangers of corpse decay, disease spread, and improper burial, the response was the same. Organized defense, spiritual expertise, community cooperation. The Jiangshi wasn't just a monster to fear. It was a problem to solve. And Chinese villages developed sophisticated systems for solving it. The relationship between Jiangshi and family is particularly painful. Unlike random monsters attacking strangers, many Jiangshi stories involve family members recognizing their reanimated dead. Imagine your father dies on a business trip. The corpse herder is hired. The journey begins, and somewhere along the way, something goes wrong. Weeks later, your father's body appears at your door, hopping, talisman fallen, arms reaching for you. Do you see a monster? Or do you see your father? The psychological horror of Jiangshi folklore often centered on this recognition. The corpse wearing familiar clothes. The face you knew, now green-tinged and stiff. The body that raised you, now trying to drain your ki. Family members had to make impossible choices. Flee from their loved one's body. Fight it. Watch as a Taoist priest destroyed what remained. The Jiangshi wasn't just a threat. It was a desecration of someone they mourned. Some stories tell of family members who couldn't bring themselves to defend against their reanimated relatives. Mothers who stood frozen as their dead sons approached. Children who refused to throw rice at their grandmother's corpse. The Jiangshi would drain them first, not from malice, but because they were the closest living ki. This created deep guilt among survivors. They'd failed to protect their loved one from becoming a monster. They'd failed to bury them properly. And now they'd failed to stop them when they returned wrong. Proper burial rites became even more critical when you understood what failure meant. You weren't just disrespecting the dead. You were potentially creating a monster wearing your loved one's face. The folklore also addressed the question of consciousness. Did the Jiangshi remember being human? Some stories said yes. The reanimated corpse retained fragments of memory, drawn instinctively toward familiar places and people. It returned home not to attack, but because home was the last thing it remembered. Other stories said no. The Jiangshi was pure instinct. All human consciousness gone, leaving only hunger for qi. The body was a shell, moved by residual energy, containing nothing of the person it once was. Both versions are horrifying in different ways. If the Jiangshi remembers, then it's suffering, trapped in a rotting body, unable to communicate, driven by needs it can't control. If it doesn't remember, then your loved one is truly gone, and what's hopping toward you is just animated meat. Either way, families faced the same outcome. The person they knew was dead. What remained had to be stopped. And proper burial, finally correctly performed, was the only way to give them peace. The emotional weight of Jiangshi folklore is often overlooked in favor of the physical horror. But for the people who believed in this, the real terror wasn't being attacked by a monster. It was recognizing the monster as someone you loved. Regional variations of Jiangshi folklore exist throughout China, each adding local flavor to the basic concept. In southern provinces near water, Jiangshi stories often involved drowned corpses, bodies pulled from rivers that reanimated due to water-trapped qi. These Jiangshi were described as waterlogged, slower but more persistent, with a smell of river mud accompanying the decay. Northern regions, with their harsher winters, had stories of frozen Jiangshi, corpses preserved by cold, reanimating when spring thaws began. These versions emphasized the preservation aspect, bodies that looked almost alive despite being dead for months. Urban areas, particularly in later periods as cities grew, developed Jiangshi stories involving modern elements. Corpses disturbed by construction projects, bodies abandoned in rapidly expanding neighborhoods, the monster adapting to contemporary settings while maintaining its traditional characteristics. Some regions emphasized different weaknesses. Coastal areas added salt as a deterrent, salt water and purification. Mountain regions focused on specific herbs found in high altitudes. The core mechanics remained consistent, but local resources influenced the practical defenses. Ethnic minority groups within China had their own variations, sometimes blending Jiangshi characteristics with local death spirits and burial traditions. The Miao people, for instance, had similar hopping corpse stories, but with different ritual solutions based on their spiritual practices. These regional differences didn't fracture the folklore. They enriched it. The Jiangshi remained recognizable across variations while adapting to local needs and beliefs. It became a shared cultural touchstone while maintaining local distinctiveness. What's fascinating is how the basic mechanics, hopping movement, key draining, talisman control, rice peachwood defenses remained remarkably consistent. Whether you were in Guangdong or Shaanxi, the Jiangshi functioned the same way. Only the details varied. This consistency suggests the folklore wasn't invented randomly in different places. It spread from a common source, or emerged from shared cultural practices, corpse transportation, Taoist rituals, ancestor worship that existed throughout China. The Jiangshi became a national monster, recognized everywhere, feared everywhere, handled with the same basic tools everywhere. Regional pride might argue about which province had the scariest version, but everyone agreed on what you needed to survive. Rice, peachwood, proper rituals, and a very good Taoist priest. By the early 20th century, as China modernized, traditional Jiangshi beliefs began to fade. Urbanization, Western medicine, modern transportation, and scientific education all contributed to declining belief in hopping corpses. Young people, especially those educated in the new schools, dismissed Jiangshi as superstition. The corpse herding profession essentially disappeared as trains and motor vehicles made long-distance body transportation quick and efficient. Taoist priests adapted, focusing on other spiritual services or declining in number as secularization spread. The elaborate funeral rites that had sustained Jiangshi prevention became simplified, then optional, then forgotten by many families. But the folklore didn't die. It transformed. In the 1980s, Hong Kong cinema rediscovered the Jiangshi and turned it into a pop culture phenomenon. Films like Mr. Vampire and its sequels presented the hopping corpse not as pure horror, but as action comedy. Kung fu monks fighting Jiangshi, slapstick scenes of characters trying to hold their breath while corpses hopped past. The horror elements remained, but filtered through humor and spectacular martial arts choreography. These films were hugely successful, not just in Hong Kong, but throughout Asia and among Chinese diaspora communities worldwide. The Jiangshi became iconic, instantly recognizable, widely referenced, and completely embedded in popular culture. Video games featured Jiangshi as enemies. Anime and manga borrowed the concept. The image of the hopping corpse in Qing robes became a visual shorthand for Chinese supernatural horror, recognizable even to people who'd never heard the original folklore. This pop culture revival had an interesting effect. It kept the Jiangshi alive in cultural consciousness while simultaneously distancing it from serious belief. The monster became entertainment, nostalgia, a symbol of Chinese cultural identity rather than a genuine spiritual threat. Modern Chinese people, particularly younger generations, know about Jiangshi primarily through movies, not through family stories or religious teaching. They can describe what a Jiangshi looks like and how to defeat it, but as fictional knowledge rather than practical survival information. Some traditionalists lament this transformation, viewing it as a cheapening of genuine spiritual beliefs. Others see it as cultural preservation through adaptation, keeping the folklore alive by making it relevant to contemporary audiences. The debate mirrors broader tensions in Chinese society about tradition versus modernity, superstition versus science, cultural heritage versus progress. The Jiangshi, awkwardly hopping through these debates, became a symbol of that tension. What's undeniable is that the Jiangshi survived, not as literal belief for most people, but as cultural icon. And in that survival, it maintained a connection to the historical practices, spiritual beliefs, and death rituals that created it. The hopping corpse hops on, just in different contexts now. So what do we make of the Jiangshi? This monster that's simultaneously terrifying and absurd, rooted in real practices, but sustained by supernatural belief? At its core, the Jiangshi represents human anxiety about death and the treatment of the dead. It answers the question, what happens when we fail to honor our deceased properly? In a culture that placed enormous importance on ancestor worship and proper burial, the Jiangshi was the worst-case scenario. Your loved one not resting peacefully, but trapped in a rotting body, unable to move on, driven by hunger and instinct. Every family's nightmare made manifest. The monster also reflected practical concerns. Corpse transportation was genuinely dangerous and logistically complex. Bodies decayed, disease spread. The process could fail in numerous ways. The Jiangshi gave those failures a face, made abstract dangers concrete and manageable through ritual solutions. From a psychological perspective, the Jiangshi allowed communities to process death-related trauma. When someone died far from home, when bodies couldn't be returned, when burial rites failed, the Jiangshi mythology provided an explanation and a path forward. Not, we failed our dead, but we're fighting a monster. The latter is easier to handle emotionally. The defenses, rice, peachwood, proper rituals. created a sense of control in the face of death's ultimate uncontrollability. You can't prevent death, but you can prevent reanimation if you follow the correct steps. The folklore was empowering in that sense. Culturally, the Jiangshi remains significant as a distinctly Chinese monster. It doesn't map onto Western vampire mythology, despite superficial similarities. It emerges from specific historical practices, specific religious beliefs, specific social anxieties that are uniquely Chinese. And yet, it speaks to universal fears. The fear of improper death, the fear that our bodies might not rest, the fear that death isn't final, the fear of seeing our loved ones transformed into something horrible. The Jiangshi's absurdity, the hopping, the rice, the paper talisman, doesn't diminish its horror. If anything, it enhances it. The monster is ridiculous and terrifying simultaneously, which creates cognitive dissonance that makes it memorable. You can laugh at a hopping corpse until you imagine actually encountering one. Then the laughter stops. The stiff movement stops being funny and starts being deeply, viscerally wrong. The rice defense stops being silly and starts being desperately necessary. Context transforms absurdity into horror, and the Jiangshi exists perpetually in that transformation, balanced between laughter and fear, between cultural icon and genuine nightmare. The Jiangshi didn't exist in isolation. It was part of a broader Chinese cosmology involving ghosts, spirits, demons, and the complex bureaucracy of the afterlife. Understanding where the Jiangshi fits into this supernatural landscape helps explain why it was feared in such specific ways. Chinese folk religion posits multiple souls. The Han, spiritual and ethereal, ascends to heaven after death. The Po, corporeal and tied to the physical body, descends into the earth. Ideally, these separate cleanly. The Han moves on to the afterlife or reincarnation. The Po dissipates as the body decays. But sometimes the separation fails. Violent death, improper burial, strong emotional attachment to life. Any of these can prevent clean separation. The Han might linger, becoming a ghost. The Po might remain active in the corpse, becoming a Jiangshi. So the Jiangshi isn't the person's spirit. It's the leftover body energy, the Po that didn't dissipate properly, animating a corpse that should be still. This distinction matters because it means the Jiangshi isn't motivated by human consciousness or emotion. It's operating on base instinct, hunger for qi, the energy that keeps it animated. This is why talking to a Jiangshi doesn't work. You can't reason with it, negotiate with it, or appeal to memories of who it used to be. The person is gone. What remains is biological momentum, decay temporarily held off by residual energy, looking for more energy to sustain itself. Other Chinese monsters operate differently. Hungry ghosts, egui, are spirits driven by unfulfilled desires, usually related to how they died. They're ethereal, unable to physically interact with the world, except through possession or spiritual influence. Fox spirits, Huli Jing, are shapeshifters, intelligent and often seductive, able to take human form and integrate into society. They're not undead. They're living beings with supernatural abilities. The Jiangshi occupies a middle ground. Physical like a fox spirit, but mindless like a hungry ghost. It has the worst aspects of both categories. Dangerous physicality without intelligence, relentless hunger without purpose. In the hierarchy of threats, Jiangshi were considered manageable, but requiring specialist intervention. Ghosts could be addressed through offerings and proper funeral rites. Demons required serious exorcism. Jiangshi needed Taoist priests with specific training, but weren't considered as dangerous as true demonic possession. This practical categorization reflects how folklore served as a survival guide. Different threats required different responses, and knowing what you were dealing with determined whether you needed offerings, exorcism, or a bag of rice. The Jiangshi's place in this system, physical undead, Po animated, P hungry, made it uniquely positioned between the living and the dead. Not quite either, dangerous to both, and requiring solutions that address the body rather than the spirit. Let's talk about the actual mechanics of qi in more detail, because understanding this concept is essential to understanding why the Jiangshi functions the way it does. Qi isn't just life energy in a vague mystical sense. In traditional Chinese medicine and philosophy, qi is the fundamental force that animates all living things. It flows through meridians in the body, just as blood flows through veins. When qi flows smoothly and abundantly, you're healthy. When it's blocked or depleted, you get sick. Everyone generates qi naturally through breathing, eating, and living. Your qi is constantly being replenished by these basic life functions. It circulates through your body, maintaining your health, your consciousness, your ability to move and think and exist. When you die, qi production stops. The qi already in your body begins to dissipate. Normally, this process is complete within days. The qi flows out, the body becomes truly inert, and only decay remains. But if something prevents complete dissipation, improper burial, spiritual disturbance, the po remaining attached, the body retains residual qi. Not enough to truly live, but enough to animate. This residual qi is what makes a Jiangshi. The problem is that residual qi degrades. It can't be replenished through normal means, because the body isn't breathing, eating, or living. So the Jiangshi needs external qi to sustain itself. It hunts living beings and drains their qi, temporarily boosting its own supply. This creates a cycle. The Jiangshi drains qi, which allows it to continue existing, which requires more qi, which requires more draining. It's not malicious. It's desperate. Like a drowning person grabbing onto others and pulling them under. Pure survival instinct without consciousness to modulate it. The qi draining process itself is described in the folklore as a transfer. When the Jiangshi grabs you, it creates a connection between its qi system and yours. Your qi flows toward the depletion, like water flowing downhill. The Jiangshi absorbs it, and you feel yourself weakening. Victims describe extreme cold, which makes sense metaphorically. Qi is associated with warmth and life, so losing qi would feel like losing heat. They describe weakness, exhaustion, the sensation of being hollowed out. Some accounts mention visual disturbances, like the world becoming dimmer, which could be qi depletion affecting consciousness. If the Jiangshi drains enough qi, you die. Not from physical injury, but from having insufficient qi to maintain life functions. Your heart simply stops. Your breathing ceases. The fundamental force that kept you alive is gone. And here's the truly horrifying part. A person killed by qi draining is already in a compromised state regarding their po. The violent nature of the death, the spiritual connection to the Jiangshi, the fact that their qi was forcibly extracted. All of this makes their corpse more vulnerable to becoming a Jiangshi itself. This is how outbreaks happened. One Jiangshi creates several victims. Those victims reanimate. Now you have multiple Jiangshi. Each creates more victims. Exponential growth until the entire area is overrun with hopping corpses. The qi mechanics also explain the defenses. Glutinous rice is believed to have strong yang qi, life energy, warmth, vitality. When it contacts the Jiangshi's degraded, stagnant qi, the clash is painful for the corpse. It's not physical damage. It's spiritual incompatibility, like trying to mix substances that violently repel each other. Peachwood works similarly. Peach trees are associated with longevity and concentrated yang qi. A peachwood sword doesn't cut the Jiangshi. It disrupts its qi field, breaking the delicate balance that keeps the corpse animated. One solid hit with a peachwood weapon can scatter the Jiangshi's qi completely, causing immediate collapse. Chicken blood, particularly from black roosters, is pure yang essence. Painting it across doorways creates a barrier the Jiangshi's yin-dominated qi can't cross. It's not a physical wall. It's a spiritual boundary, one energy system unable to penetrate another. The breath detection mechanic relates to qi as well. When you breathe, you're not just moving air, you're cycling qi. Inhaling brings fresh qi in from the environment. Exhaling releases degraded qi. This constant exchange is part of what keeps you alive. The Jiangshi senses this qi exchange. It feels the fresh qi coming in with each breath, like a shark sensing blood in water. Holding your breath temporarily stops the qi cycling, making you less detectable. But you can't stop forever. Eventually you breathe, and the Jiangshi knows exactly where you are. Understanding qi as a real concept within Chinese philosophy, not just fantasy magic, makes the Jiangshi more coherent. It's not random supernatural rules. It's logical within the framework of traditional Chinese cosmology. The monster operates according to how qi actually functions, which makes it more frightening in a way. It follows rules, comprehensible rules, which means you can protect yourself if you understand the system. But it also means the threat is fundamental. The Jiangshi isn't attacking you with weapons or magic spells. It's attacking the very force that keeps you alive. It's not trying to kill you. It's trying to consume what makes you living. And once that's gone, you're not just dead. You're potentially the next Jiangshi. The Taoist rituals for controlling Jiangshi weren't simple spells. They were complex procedures based on centuries of spiritual knowledge, trial and error, and genuine danger. Let's examine how these rituals actually worked. The paper talisman is the most iconic element, but creating one wasn't as simple as scribbling characters on paper. The process required specific materials, precise calligraphy, proper timing, and spiritual preparation. First, the paper had to be yellow, specifically a particular shade associated with earth element and yang energy. White paper wouldn't work. The color mattered because it corresponded to the 5-element system that governed Taoist magic. The ink was traditionally chicken blood, preferably from a black rooster killed at dawn when yang energy was strongest. Some priests used cinnabar ink instead, ground from mercury sulfide, which was believed to have powerful spiritual properties. The red color connected to both blood, life, and fire, transformation. The characters written on the talisman weren't ordinary Chinese writing. They were specialized script, sometimes called ghost characters or thunder characters, taught only within Taoist lineages. Each stroke had to be executed in a specific order with specific intent. A wrong stroke could render the talisman useless or even dangerous. The most common talismans for Jiangshi control included characters invoking celestial generals, thunder gods, or earth deities. The idea was to borrow the authority of these higher powers to bind the corpse. The talisman didn't generate power itself. It channeled power from the spiritual hierarchy. Writing the talisman required the priest to be in a purified state. Fasting beforehand, ritual bathing, mental focus through meditation. The priest had to channel his own qi into the writing process, essentially programming the talisman with spiritual intent. Once written, the talisman had to be activated through chanting. Specific sutras or mantras that called the invoked deities to witness and empower the talisman. Without activation, it was just ink on paper. With activation, it became a binding contract between the spiritual realm and the physical corpse. Applying the talisman to a Jiangshi was the dangerous part. You had to get close enough to stick it to the corpse's forehead while avoiding its grasping arms. Priests used distraction techniques, spells to confuse the Jiangshi's qi sensing, mirrors to disorient it, or assistants to draw its attention while the priest approached from behind. The moment the talisman made contact, if properly prepared, the Jiangshi would freeze. Its arms would drop. Its hopping would cease. The Po energy animating the corpse was suddenly bound by the spiritual authority invoked in the talisman. But this binding wasn't permanent. The talisman would eventually lose power as its qi dissipated or if physical damage removed it. Rain could wash away the ink. Wind could peel the paper. The corpse's decay could weaken the adhesion. A controlled Jiangshi required constant monitoring and periodic talisman renewal. For permanent solutions, priests performed more elaborate rituals. These might involve returning the corpse to its place of death and conducting proper burial rites, or using fire to completely destroy the body, ensuring no Po energy remained, or sealing the corpse in a specially prepared coffin with talismans on all sides, essentially creating a spiritual prison. The most powerful ritual was called scattering the Po, where the priest would use a peachwood sword to strike specific points on the corpse while chanting dispersal sutras. This actively broke apart the Po energy, forcing it to dissipate completely. Done correctly, the corpse would collapse into true death, never to rise again. But these rituals were exhausting for the priest. They required tremendous ki expenditure. Essentially, the priest was using his own life force to manipulate the corpse's residual energy. After subduing a Jiangshi, priests often needed days of rest and meditation to recover their depleted ki. Young or inexperienced priests sometimes died attempting these rituals. They'd overextend themselves, drain too much of their own ki, and collapse. The Jiangshi would then drain what remained, and the village would have lost both its defender and gained another potential corpse for reanimation. This danger meant that Taoist training for Jiangshi specialists took years. Apprentices learned theory first, key mechanics, talisman writing, sutra memorization. Then they observed masters performing rituals. Only after demonstrating competence were they allowed to attempt actual Jiangshi control, and even then, only with a master supervising. The ritual knowledge was closely guarded, passed down through lineages, teacher to student, with careful selection of who was taught the most dangerous techniques. Not everyone who wanted to be a Taoist priest had the spiritual capacity or discipline to handle Jiangshi safely. And the knowledge wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. Priests learned to identify corpses at high risk of reanimation by observing decay patterns, sensing residual ki, and recognizing the signs of improper burial. Prevention was always better than confrontation. They also learned negotiation. Sometimes a family couldn't afford the full ritual cost. Priests had to balance spiritual duty with practical economics, offering scaled services or payment plans. The work was as much social service as supernatural combat. The tools priests carried, bells, swords, mirrors, inkstones, paper, herbs, comprised a traveling exorcism kit. Everything needed to address a Jiangshi problem wherever it appeared. And because the work required travel, priests developed networks, sharing information about outbreaks, warning each other about dangerous areas, and sometimes collaborating on particularly difficult cases. One Jiangshi might be manageable. 3 Jiangshi required a team of priests. 10 Jiangshi meant evacuating the area and burning the entire district to scatter all Po energy at once. The rituals scaled, but so did the risk. The Taoist response to Jiangshi was systematic, professional, and genuinely dangerous. It wasn't mystical nonsense. Within the framework of Chinese spiritual beliefs, it was sophisticated engineering. The priests were technicians of the supernatural, using tools and techniques refined over generations to manage a specific type of threat. And when it worked, villages could rest safely. When it failed, people died and corpses multiplied. The stakes were always real. Now let's explore the social implications of Jiangshi belief, because this wasn't just personal fear. It shaped community organization, social hierarchies, and economic systems. Funeral services became critical industries. Families saved money specifically for proper burial. Skimping on funeral costs wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. A cheap funeral without proper rites risked creating a Jiangshi. So even poor families went into debt to afford basic protections. This created opportunities for exploitation. Unscrupulous morticians charged excessive fees, claiming certain rituals were absolutely necessary when they were actually optional. Families, terrified of reanimation, paid. The fear of the Jiangshi became a revenue stream. Taoist priests faced similar temptations. A priest could claim a corpse was high risk and needed extra rituals, extra talismans, extra payments. Without expertise to verify these claims, families paid. Some priests were genuine specialists. Others were spiritual con artists trading on fear. But the fear was real enough that communities policed themselves. Neighbors noticed if a family skipped proper burial rites. Social pressure ensured compliance. Not just for religious reasons, but because one family's negligence could create a monster that threatened everyone. This created a strange social contract. The community helped poorer families afford basic funerals because it was collective defense. If your neighbor couldn't afford proper burial, you contributed, not from charity, but from self-preservation. Their monster became your problem. Villages near major corpse-herding routes developed entire economies around the trade. Specialized inns where herders could rest. Suppliers selling talismans, bells, and blessed items. Priests who stationed themselves along routes specifically to handle emergencies. Guards who would escort herders through dangerous areas. These support industries created jobs, but also created dependencies. When corpse herding declined in the 20th century, these communities lost their economic foundation. Towns that had prospered from death trade suddenly had no purpose. The belief also affected property values. Homes near graveyards sold for less because of Jiangshi risk. Land where violent deaths occurred was avoided. Even urban property could be affected if it was near a corpse-herding route or a site of improper burial. This created geographic stratification. The wealthy lived far from death-associated areas. The poor lived where land was cheap, which often meant living where Jiangshi risk was highest. Class and safety became intertwined. Your wealth determined your distance from potential reanimation. Legal systems had to accommodate Jiangshi beliefs. Some regions had laws about corpse transportation, requiring permits and specifying approved routes. Violations could result in fines or imprisonment because illegal corpse herding endangered communities. There were also cases where Jiangshi attacks were used as legal defenses. Someone killed their neighbor, claimed the neighbor was a Jiangshi. Self-defense against the undead was legitimate. Of course, proving the victim was actually a Jiangshi rather than just a person you murdered was difficult, but the defense existed. Insurance-like systems emerged in some areas. Families could pay into community funds that would cover funeral costs if someone died unexpectedly far from home. Essentially, Jiangshi prevention insurance. Not formalized like modern insurance, but functionally similar. Spreading risk across the community. Marriage negotiations sometimes included funeral cost provisions. When arranging a marriage, families would discuss what would happen if the groom died during the marriage. Who paid for returning his body? What rituals would be performed? These weren't romantic conversations, but they were necessary. Military service carried Jiangshi implications. Soldiers who died in battle far from home risked reanimation. Some military units employed Taoist priests specifically to handle battlefield corpses, performing quick rituals to prevent reanimation before bodies could be transported. The social fear of becoming a Jiangshi also affected behavior. People avoided unnecessary travel to dangerous areas. Merchants calculated whether profit margins justified the risk of dying far from home. Some elderly people refused to leave their villages, preferring to die where they could be buried properly rather than risk dying elsewhere. This limiting of geographic mobility had economic effects. Talent stayed local rather than migrating to opportunity. Knowledge spread slower because fewer people traveled. The Jiangshi belief, while protecting communities spiritually, constrained them economically. Education levels correlated with belief intensity. More educated, urban populations were more skeptical. Rural, Less educated populations maintained stronger belief. This created cultural divisions. Sophisticated urbanites mocking rural superstition. Rural populations maintaining that city folk had forgotten spiritual realities that kept everyone safe. These tensions persist in modern Chinese society. Older generations sometimes still follow traditional burial practices, not because they literally believe in Jiangshi, but because cultural tradition and family pressure maintain the rituals. Younger generations often view this as wasteful superstition, creating family conflicts over how to handle death. The Jiangshi, then, wasn't just a monster in folklore. It was a social force that shaped economics, law, geography, class relations, and family dynamics. The belief had real-world consequences that went far beyond individual fear. Let's examine specific historical accounts that suggest actual Jiangshi encounters, or at least genuine belief in them. County records from the Qing Dynasty occasionally mention corpse disturbances. These weren't detailed descriptions, but bureaucratic notes about incidents requiring official response. Local magistrates dispatching guards. Villages requesting government assistance. Payments to Taoist priests for subduing disturbances. The language is careful. Officials didn't explicitly write Jiangshi attack because that might sound unprofessional. But the circumstances described match Jiangshi folklore precisely. Corpses reported moving. Night incidents near graveyards. Multiple unexplained deaths in short periods. Requests for ritual specialists rather than conventional law enforcement. One account from Hunan province describes a series of deaths in 3 villages over one summer. The pattern was consistent. Victims found dead without wounds, appearing drained and cold. A traveling corpse herder had passed through the area weeks earlier and had mentioned losing track of one body during a storm. Authorities hired several Taoist priests who tracked something to an abandoned temple. Whatever happened, there wasn't recorded in detail, but the priests burned the temple, and the deaths stopped. The report concludes with payments to the priests and orders for improved corpse transport regulations. Was this an actual Jiangshi? Or was it disease? Perhaps a pathogen that left victims appearing bloodless and cold? Or was it murder, explained away through supernatural belief? The record can't tell us, but it demonstrates that local government took the threat seriously enough to allocate resources. Another account from Sichuan describes a village that evacuated entirely. The record states that corpses rose and the living fled. No details about what caused the corpses to rise or how many were involved. But the abandonment was real. The village remained empty for years, considered cursed ground. Later visitors reported that some structures had been burned deliberately. Fires set to destroy reanimated corpses rather than accidental blazes. The village was eventually resettled only after Taoist priests performed extensive purification rituals. Personal accounts exist in family records and diaries, though these are harder to verify. A merchant's journal from the 1870s describes encountering what he believed was a corpse herder's train at night. He heard bells and saw figures hopping along the road. He hid, terrified, until they passed. He may have seen an actual corpse herding operation, or he may have misidentified travelers in the dark, interpreting ambiguous sights through the lens of Jiangshi belief. But the fear in his writing is genuine. He genuinely thought he'd barely avoided an encounter with the hopping dead. Missionary records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries often mention Chinese beliefs about corpses. Western missionaries, trying to convert populations, encountered resistance based on these beliefs. Some wrote dismissively about superstitious fears. Others documented the beliefs with anthropological interest. One missionary doctor wrote about being asked to examine a corpse to verify it was truly dead and wouldn't rise. The family wouldn't proceed with burial until a Western-educated doctor confirmed death. The doctor found this bizarre but complied, effectively serving the same function as a Taoist priest's verification. What's striking about these accounts is the consistency. Different regions, different time periods, but the same core elements: hopping movement, night encounters, key draining, Taoist responses. This consistency suggests either a genuinely widespread phenomenon or a very successful folklore transmission system. Modern attempts to investigate these historical accounts face obvious limitations. The events happened over a century ago. Records are incomplete or lost. Eyewitnesses are long dead. Physical evidence doesn't exist. But what does exist is the cultural impact. The beliefs were strong enough to shape behavior, laws, economics, and community organization. Whether Jiangshi literally existed matters less than the fact that people genuinely believed they did and organized their entire lives around that belief. Skeptics argue that Jiangshi were misidentified natural phenomena. Disease outbreaks, corpse decay producing gases that moved bodies slightly, psychological mass hysteria, deliberate fraud by corpse herders or priests. Believers argue that the consistency of accounts across vast regions and long time periods suggests something more than misidentification. That traditional knowledge recognized genuine spiritual phenomena modern science dismisses. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Some accounts were definitely misidentification or exaggeration. Others may have been deliberate deception. But the core practices, corpse transportation, Taoist rituals, community defense strategies, addressed real problems in their historical context. Whether those problems were literal hopping corpses or the more mundane challenges of death, decay, and disease management, the Jiangshi belief system provided workable solutions. And in a pre-modern context where scientific understanding was limited, supernatural explanation and ritual solution were entirely reasonable approaches. The Jiangshi was real in the sense that it was a culturally recognized category of threat with established response protocols. Whether it was real in the sense of being an actual supernatural entity is perhaps the wrong question. It was real enough to matter. Now let's discuss what happens when Jiangshi belief intersects with other Chinese supernatural concepts. Because the cosmology, it's complicated. Ghosts, as mentioned earlier, are different from Jiangshi. Ghosts are spiritual entities without physical form. They can't be touched or directly harmed by physical objects. But they can possess living people, causing erratic behavior or illness. Sometimes, a Jiangshi situation began with ghost possession. A person died violently, becoming a ghost. That ghost possessed someone else, causing them to die violently. That second death created a Jiangshi. Now you had two problems, a ghost and a hopping corpse, requiring different solutions. Fox spirits added another layer. These shapeshifters sometimes mimicked human form so convincingly that they could die as humans, leaving corpses that retained some fox spirit energy. If that corpse reanimated, you had something between a Jiangshi and a fox spirit, a hybrid monster with characteristics of both. These weren't common in folklore, but they appeared occasionally in stories meant to demonstrate that the supernatural world had edge cases and complications. A Taoist priest prepared to handle a standard Jiangshi might find himself facing something more complex. Demons, Yao Guai, were an entirely different category, often non-human entities that could possess or transform corpses for their own purposes. A demon might deliberately reanimate a corpse, using it as a puppet. This demon-controlled Jiangshi would be more dangerous because it had intelligence directing it. Distinguishing between a true Jiangshi, Po-animated corpse, and a demon-possessed corpse required expertise. The symptoms were similar, but the solutions differed. Standard talismans might not work on demon-possessed corpses. More powerful exorcism was needed. The bureaucracy of the afterlife added administrative complexity. According to Chinese folk belief, the dead were supposed to report to the underworld, where they'd be judged and assigned to appropriate afterlife destinations. A Jiangshi represented someone who skipped this process. Underworld officials, themselves supernatural beings, sometimes sent agents to collect overdue souls. These agents might clash with Taoist priests, who were trying to disperse the Jiangshi's Po energy. Whose authority took precedence? The underworld bureaucracy or the living world spiritual specialists? Some stories involve negotiations between priests and underworld agents. The priest argues the corpse needs dispersal for public safety. The agent argues the soul needs collection for afterlife processing. They reach compromises. The priest disperses the Po while the agent collects the Hun, satisfying both spiritual and bureaucratic requirements. This might sound absurd, but it reflects a deeply bureaucratic worldview where even the supernatural operates through proper channels and official procedures. Very Chinese cultural perspective. Even death and undeath require paperwork. Ancestor spirits introduced another complication. Properly venerated ancestors could provide protection to their descendants, including protection from Jiangshi. Some families reported that praying to ancestor spirits helped repel hopping corpses, as if the ancestors were interceding. But what if the Jiangshi was your ancestor? Did they lose their protective role? Could you pray to other ancestors for help against a reanimated family member? The theological complications multiplied. Some folk beliefs held that a Jiangshi retained vestigial connection to their living descendants. If their descendants performed the correct rituals, the Jiangshi might voluntarily cease animation, essentially the Po recognizing family and choosing to rest. But this was dangerous. Approaching a Jiangshi to perform rituals required getting close enough to be grabbed and drained. Buddhist beliefs added yet another layer. Buddhism taught reincarnation, the soul moving through cycles of rebirth. But Buddhism also taught that improper death or attachment could trap souls. A Jiangshi represented the worst-case scenario, trapped in a decaying body, unable to reincarnate, suffering continuously. Buddhist monks sometimes attempted to help Jiangshi through compassionate release, chanting sutras to free the trapped soul, while Taoist priests handled the physical corpse. This cooperative approach combined Buddhist spiritual aid with Taoist practical exorcism. Different philosophical schools debated these interactions. Confucians focused on proper ritual to prevent Jiangshi. Taoists developed practical solutions for existing Jiangshi. Buddhists emphasized compassion for the suffering entity. All three perspectives coexisted, sometimes complementing each other, sometimes conflicting. The average villager didn't worry about these theological nuances. They just wanted the hopping corpse gone. But for specialists, priests, monks, scholars, these questions mattered. Understanding exactly what type of supernatural problem you faced determined the correct solution. And getting the solution wrong could make things worse. Try to exorcise a demon with anti-Jiangshi talismans? The demon laughs and escalates. Try to collect an ancestor spirit like a common Jiangshi? You've insulted your entire family lineage, and spiritual consequences follow. The complexity of Chinese supernatural cosmology meant that the Jiangshi was just one category in a vast taxonomy of threats. Knowing your enemy wasn't just useful. It was necessary for survival. By the early 20th century, as China modernized, traditional Jiangshi beliefs began to fade. Urbanization, Western medicine, modern transportation, and scientific education all contributed to declining belief in hopping corpses. Young people, especially those educated in the new schools, dismissed Jiangshi as superstition. The corpse-herding profession essentially disappeared as trains and motor vehicles made long-distance body transportation quick and efficient. Refrigeration meant bodies could be moved without immediate decay concerns. Taoist priests adapted, focusing on other spiritual services or declining in number as secularization spread. The elaborate funeral rites that had sustained Jiangshi prevention became simplified, then optional, and forgotten by many families. The monster seemed destined for cultural extinction. Another relic of the pre-modern past, abandoned as China embraced progress and rationality. But the Jiangshi refused to stay buried. In 1980, a Hong Kong film called Encounter of the Spooky Kind featured the hopping corpse as a central element. The film blended horror with martial arts and comedy, a distinctly Hong Kong genre mixture. It was moderately successful, but more importantly, it reminded audiences that the Jiangshi existed. Then came 1985's Mr. Vampire, directed by Ricky Lau. This film became a phenomenon. It took the traditional Jiangshi folklore, hopping movement, paper talismans, Taoist priests, breath-holding defense, and presented it with spectacular action choreography, clever humor, and genuine scares. The film starred Lam Qingying as a Taoist priest who was stern, competent, and just slightly ridiculous in his absolute seriousness about corpse management. His character treated Jiangshi hunting like a blue-collar job with occupational hazards. Very professional approach to dealing with hopping dead people. Mr. Vampire became one of the highest-grossing Hong Kong films of the decade. It spawned multiple sequels, countless imitators, and an entire subgenre of Jiangshi films. The hopping corpse was suddenly everywhere. Movie posters, toys, video games, television shows. What made these films work was their tone. They didn't treat Jiangshi as pure horror or pure comedy. They found a balance, acknowledging that a hopping corpse is objectively ridiculous, while also presenting it as genuinely dangerous. The humor came from the situations, rather than mocking the concept. Characters would frantically hold their breath, while a Jiangshi hopped past, faces turning red, eyes bulging. Then they'd exhale in relief, and immediately get grabbed because they forgot about the second Jiangshi. Physical comedy blended seamlessly with supernatural threat. The Taoist priests in these films were portrayed as working-class heroes. They had specialized knowledge, useful skills, and absolutely no patience for people who didn't follow their instructions. "I told you to hold your breath," was often said while someone was being drained of qi. Occupational frustration meets the undead. The films also emphasized the practical aspects of corpse management. Priests would complain about clients who couldn't afford proper rituals. Corpse herders would grumble about difficult terrain. And everyone agreed that transporting multiple bodies at once was asking for trouble. It treated supernatural work like any other blue-collar profession. Hard, dangerous, and underpaid. This approach worked brilliantly. It made the Jiangshi accessible to modern audiences who might have dismissed traditional folklore as outdated. The film said, "Yes, this is absurd, but within that absurdity are genuine stakes and real danger. You can laugh at the hopping movement while still being scared of what happens if it catches you." Younger viewers who had never heard the original folklore learned about Jiangshi through these films. The image of the corpse in Qing robes, paper talisman on forehead, arms outstretched, hopping stiffly through darkness, became iconic. But this popularization also created distance from the original beliefs. The Jiangshi became entertainment rather than spiritual threat. It was a monster in movies, not something that might actually appear in your village. Older viewers who remembered when people genuinely feared Jiangshi had mixed reactions. Some appreciated the cultural preservation. The films kept the folklore alive, even if through commercialization. Others felt the humor trivialized genuine spiritual beliefs that had guided communities for centuries. The films spread beyond Hong Kong. They were released throughout Asia, subtitled in multiple languages, and found audiences in Chinese diaspora communities worldwide. Japanese anime and manga borrowed the concept. Korean films created their own versions. Video games featured Jiangshi as enemies or characters. The hopping corpse became globally recognizable. People who had never set foot in China and knew nothing about Taoist rituals could still identify a Jiangshi instantly. The Qing robes, the talisman, the hopping, all became visual shorthand for Chinese supernatural horror. This global spread created interesting cultural translations. Western audiences sometimes confused Jiangshi with vampires, calling them Chinese vampires, despite the significant differences. The qi draining became energy vampirism. The Taoist rituals were compared to Van Helsing's vampire hunting. The original cultural context was often lost in translation, but at least the monster survived. In whatever form, however diluted or transformed, the Jiangshi remained in global cultural consciousness. It hadn't been forgotten. It had evolved. The Hong Kong cinema boom eventually declined. By the late 1990s, Jiangshi films were less common, the genre having exhausted most of its variations. But the cultural impact persisted. The Jiangshi remained iconic, referenced, recognized. Modern Chinese horror occasionally returns to Jiangshi, usually attempting to recapture the magic of the 1980s films. These newer versions sometimes try to make the monster scarier, removing the comedy and emphasizing pure horror. They rarely succeed as well as the originals. Turns out the balance between ridiculous and terrifying was what made the concept work. Video games continue using Jiangshi regularly. They appear in fighting games, horror games, action games, usually as mid-tier enemies that hop toward the player character. Game designers love them because the hopping movement is visually distinctive and the vulnerability to specific items creates interesting gameplay mechanics. The internet age gave the Jiangshi new life through memes, fan art, and online discussions. Young people discovered the monster through random internet browsing, became fascinated, researched the folklore, and created new content. The Jiangshi became a subcultural touchstone for people interested in global folklore and weird monsters. Cosplayers at conventions dressed as Jiangshi, complete with Qing robes and paper talismans. The costume was relatively simple, but immediately recognizable. And the hopping walk was perfect for convention floor performance. Distinctive, silly, and attention-grabbing. The Jiangshi's journey from genuine spiritual threat to pop culture icon to internet meme represents a complete transformation. The monster that once terrified villages now appears in children's cartoons. The creature that required professional Taoist intervention now shows up in mobile games as comic relief. Some traditionalists lament this transformation. The sacred became profane. The serious became silly. Ancient spiritual wisdom reduced to entertainment. Others see it as cultural survival through adaptation. The folklore changed form but persisted. Each generation reinterprets the Jiangshi for their own context. The 1980s needed action comedy. The 2020s need memes. The core concept endures through transformation. What's undeniable is that the Hong Kong cinema revival saved the Jiangshi from cultural extinction. Without those films, younger generations would have forgotten entirely. The monster would be an obscure footnote in academic folklore studies, known only to specialists. Instead, the Jiangshi hops on. Different context, different meaning, but recognizable, memorable, alive in cultural consciousness. The hopping corpse refuses to stay dead, even in the modern world, especially in the modern world, because apparently, even monsters can go viral. Now let's examine how modern Chinese people, particularly younger, urban, educated populations, relate to Jiangshi folklore today. For most young Chinese people, the Jiangshi is primarily a cultural reference point rather than a genuine belief. They know what it is. They've seen the movies or video games. They understand the basic concept. Hopping corpse, paper talisman, Taoist priest control. But they don't believe it's real. At least not in any literal sense. This creates an interesting relationship with the folklore. It's simultaneously their cultural heritage and something slightly embarrassing when explained to non-Chinese people. Yes, we have folklore about hopping vampires defeated by rice. Sounds ridiculous out loud, even though it's no more absurd than Western vampires being defeated by garlic or werewolves transforming during full moons. Every culture's folklore sounds weird when stated plainly. The Jiangshi just happens to sound particularly weird because the hopping movement is so visually distinctive and comedically awkward. Urban Chinese youth engage with Jiangshi primarily through popular culture. They watch the old Hong Kong films ironically, appreciating the campy special effects and over-the-top acting. They share Jiangshi memes online. They reference the monster in casual conversation when discussing anything related to Chinese supernatural beliefs. But there's often affection beneath the irony. The Jiangshi represents connection to cultural history, to grandparent stories, to a pre-modern world that still influences contemporary Chinese identity. Even if they don't believe, they appreciate having something distinctively Chinese to contribute to global monster folklore. Rural and older populations maintain more complex relationships with the beliefs. Many don't literally believe in Jiangshi, but continue following traditional burial practices out of habit, family pressure, or respect for tradition. The rituals persist even when the underlying belief has weakened. This creates generational tensions. Elderly family members insist on expensive, elaborate funerals with all traditional elements. Younger family members view this as wasteful superstition, but comply out of filial piety. The rituals are performed without genuine belief, maintained through social obligation rather than spiritual conviction. Some younger Chinese people report that learning about Jiangshi folklore, particularly its historical context and practical functions, increases their respect for the traditions. Understanding that the beliefs addressed real problems, corpse transportation challenges, disease prevention, community organization, makes the superstition seem less foolish. Scholars and cultural critics debate what this transformation means for Chinese cultural identity. Is it loss or evolution? Are traditional beliefs being destroyed by modernization or adapted for contemporary relevance? Those arguing loss point out that when rituals are performed without belief, they become hollow performances. The spiritual depth is gone. What remains is cultural theater, going through motions that no longer carry meaning. Those arguing evolution counter that culture has always transformed. Medieval Europeans genuinely believed in demons. Modern Christians often interpret demon stories metaphorically. The beliefs change, but the cultural continuity persists. The Jiangshi's transformation from literal threat to cultural symbol might be the same process. The Chinese government's relationship with Jiangshi folklore is cautiously positive. On one hand, official policy opposes feudal superstition. On the other hand, traditional culture is valued as part of national identity. The Jiangshi exists in this tension. Officially superstitious, but culturally significant. State-sponsored cultural programs sometimes include Jiangshi in presentations of Chinese folklore. Museums display Taoist talismans and corpse-herding equipment. The monster becomes heritage rather than belief. It's preserved as history, not practiced as religion. Chinese diaspora communities worldwide use Jiangshi as cultural touchstone. Teaching children about the hopping corpse becomes a way of maintaining Chinese identity across generations. Even if the kids think it's silly, they're learning something distinctively Chinese that connects them to heritage. International interest in Chinese culture has also revived Jiangshi awareness. As global audiences become more interested in non-Western folklore, the Jiangshi gains recognition as distinctively Chinese supernatural entity. This international attention creates domestic pride. Our monsters are cool too. The internet has created spaces where Chinese folklore enthusiasts, both ethnic Chinese and interested outsiders, share knowledge, debate interpretations, and create content. Online communities discuss historical Jiangshi accounts, analyze the folklore's origins, and compare regional variations. Some of these communities approach the subject academically, treating Jiangshi as historical and anthropological interest. Others engage more playfully, creating fan fiction, artwork, and modern reinterpretations. Both approaches keep the folklore alive in different ways. What's clear is that the Jiangshi hasn't disappeared. It's changed. Younger generations don't fear the hopping corpse the way their ancestors did, but they know about it. They reference it. They maintain connection to it as part of cultural identity. A monster exists in a liminal space, not quite believed, not quite dismissed, acknowledged as superstition, while simultaneously valued as cultural heritage, laughed at for being ridiculous, while defended as meaningfully Chinese. This ambivalence might be the most honest modern relationship with folklore. We don't believe it literally. We don't dismiss it entirely. We maintain complicated, affectionate connection to stories that shaped our ancestors' worldviews, even when those worldviews seem alien to our own. The Jiangshi persists not because modern Chinese people fear reanimated corpses. It persists because the hopping corpse represents something larger: cultural continuity, historical memory, distinctive identity. It's silly, it's serious. It's both simultaneously. Just like most meaningful cultural symbols, honestly. Let's examine what the Jiangshi reveals about universal human anxieties. Because despite its cultural specificity, the monster speaks to fears that cross boundaries. Death anxiety is obvious. Every culture develops beliefs about what happens after death and what can go wrong in the transition from living to dead. The Jiangshi represents death that doesn't finalize properly. The body continues moving, the person doesn't fully transition, and the living face consequences. This reflects genuine psychological discomfort with corpses. Dead bodies look like the people they were, but aren't those people anymore. They're simultaneously familiar and alien, human and not human. The Jiangshi makes this discomfort explicit. The corpse literally doesn't know it's supposed to stop. Western vampires, zombies, and various undead creatures all express similar anxieties through different cultural frameworks. The specific mechanics differ, but the core fear remains. Death might not be the end, and what comes after could be worse than dying. Jiangshi specifically emphasizes the physicality of death. Decay, rigor mortis, the wrongness of a body that moves when it shouldn't. This is more visceral than Western vampires, which often romanticize undeath. The Jiangshi never lets you forget you're dealing with a rotting corpse. It's death without dignity, without transcendence. Just meat that won't stop moving. The folklore also reflects anxiety about proper ritual. Chinese culture placed enormous importance on correct performance of funeral rites. The Jiangshi represents the catastrophic consequences of failure. Every culture with complex death rituals develops similar beliefs. If you don't do it right, something terrible happens. This creates useful social pressure, ensuring rituals are performed correctly, and communities maintain specialists who know the proper procedures. The supernatural threat enforces social compliance. Whether the threat is real matters less than whether people believe it enough to maintain the rituals. Family obligation anxiety runs throughout Jiangshi folklore. The pressure to bring bodies home, perform correct rites, maintain ancestral graves, all reflects the intense family bonds in Chinese culture. The Jiangshi emerges when these obligations fail, becoming a physical manifestation of family guilt. Western cultures with weaker extended family structures don't develop exactly this monster, but they develop other folklore expressing family anxiety in culturally appropriate ways. The universal element is anxiety about failing those who are connected to. The Jiangshi is just the Chinese expression of that universal fear. The key draining mechanic speaks to fears about vitality and aging. Life force slowly draining away is how aging actually feels. The Jiangshi accelerates and externalizes that process. Your energy literally sucked out by something dead. It's aging as predation, decline as attack rather than natural process. This resonates across cultures. Energy vampire mythology exists globally, though expressed through different frameworks. The fear that others drain your vitality, that proximity to dead things weakens living things, that decay is somehow contagious. All universal anxieties given different cultural forms. The Jiangshi also embodies fears about losing control, both the corpse that won't stay properly dead and the living person unable to prevent reanimation. Control is fundamental to human psychology. We need to believe our actions have predictable consequences. Monsters that emerge despite best efforts threaten that belief. The breath-holding defense is particularly interesting psychologically. It forces absolute stillness and self-control when instinct screams to run. It's a test of discipline versus panic. Many cultures developed similar stay perfectly still and maybe it won't see you folklore around various monsters. This taps into genuine survival instincts, freeze responses when facing predators. But it also represents broader anxiety about self-control. Can you master your own panic? Can you override instinct through willpower? The Jiangshi tests this repeatedly. Hold your breath. Stay calm. Don't run. Die if you fail. Class and social inequality anxieties appear in how Jiangshi risk was distributed. The poor couldn't afford proper burial and became monsters. The rich rested safely. This isn't culturally specific. It's a universal pattern in folklore. Supernatural threats disproportionately affect the marginalized, reflecting and reinforcing social hierarchies. Modern audiences often miss this dimension, focusing on the monster's physical characteristics. But the original folklore was deeply concerned with social justice. Why do some bodies rest while others hop? Why does spiritual safety depend on economic capacity? The Jiangshi forced these questions. Environmental anxiety also appears in Jiangshi beliefs. Corpses must be returned to proper land or they become dangerous. This reflects attachment to place, to ancestral territory, to the idea that land and people are spiritually connected. Displacement from homeland creates supernatural consequences. This anxiety becomes increasingly relevant in modern era of mass migration and displacement. The fear of dying far from home, of not belonging anywhere, of losing connection to place. All very contemporary, despite emerging from pre-modern folklore. What makes the Jiangshi particularly effective as anxiety expression is its physicality combined with spiritual elements. It's not just metaphor. It's a body, an actual physical rotting body that moves and threatens. This concreteness makes the anxieties more visceral, harder to dismiss. You can rationalize abstract fears. But facing a hopping corpse, even imagining one, creates immediate physical response. Your breath quickens, which would attract the Jiangshi. Your muscles tense, preparing to run, which would also attract attention. The folklore hijacks your body's fear responses, making the anxieties undeniable. Universal human fears about death, decay, family obligation, social inequality, loss of control, and displacement. All compressed into one specific monster. The Jiangshi is culturally Chinese, but psychologically universal. It speaks Chinese, but the anxieties it expresses translate globally. That's why folklore persists even when literal belief fades. The stories still address real psychological needs. They give form to formless fears. They provide frameworks for processing anxiety. They create community through shared symbolic language. The Jiangshi isn't just a hopping corpse. It's a sophisticated psychological tool for managing death anxiety in socially constructive ways. And that function remains useful, regardless of whether anyone believes corpses actually hop. Now let's draw some unexpected parallels between Jiangshi folklore and contemporary concerns, because the hopping corpse has surprising modern relevance. Consider pandemic anxiety, the fear of disease spread, the importance of proper body handling, the need for specialists with protective equipment, all central to both Jiangshi folklore and modern disease management. COVID-19 created situations that medieval Chinese villagers would recognize instantly. Bodies that couldn't be returned to families. Specialized workers handling corpses with full protective gear. Communities terrified of contamination. Overwhelmed funeral systems struggling with too many deaths too quickly. The parallel isn't exact. We understand disease mechanisms that ancient Chinese attributed to spiritual corruption. But the practical responses are remarkably similar. Isolation, protective barriers, specialized handling procedures, community-wide defensive measures. Jiangshi folklore encoded disease prevention knowledge without understanding germs. Improper burial creates danger to the living. Bodies must be handled carefully. Contamination spreads from corpse to community. These beliefs, while supernaturally framed, promoted behaviors that genuinely reduced disease transmission. Modern audiences watching corpse herders travel at night, ringing bells to warn people away, might see early public health protocols. Don't expose populations to dead bodies unnecessarily. Maintain spatial separation. Signal danger clearly. Follow established procedures. The Taoist priest's role parallels modern healthcare workers, specialists who deal with death regularly, trained in specific procedures, exhausted from constant crisis response, risking their own health to protect communities. The cultural framework differs, but the function is identical. Climate change and environmental degradation also connect Jiangshi themes. The folklore emphasized importance of proper burial in proper places. Disturb the land incorrectly, and consequences follow. This isn't just spiritual belief, it's ecological awareness. Bodies buried improperly could contaminate water sources. Mass graves created disease risk. Ignoring proper land use had cascading consequences. The supernatural framing made these warnings memorable and emotionally impactful. Modern environmental discourse says similar things with different language. Disrupt ecosystems and face consequences. Treat land carelessly and problems multiply. The connection between human activity and environmental response was understood intuitively in Jiangshi folklore, just expressed through spiritual rather than scientific frameworks. The corpse transportation system reflected deep understanding of decay, preservation, and environmental factors affecting both. Moving bodies required considering temperature, humidity, terrain, water sources. All practical environmental awareness disguised as supernatural practice. Social inequality parallels remain depressingly relevant. The Jiangshi threat disproportionately affected the poor who couldn't afford proper burial. Modern death remains economically stratified. Expensive funerals, quality health care at end of life, even how bodies are mourned, all depend on resources. The supernatural justification has disappeared, but the inequality persists. We don't believe poor corpses become monsters. We just accept that poor people receive worse death care. The Jiangshi at least made the inequality explicit and framed it as problem requiring community response. Migration and displacement anxieties intensify globally. People dying far from home, unable to return to homeland, disconnected from ancestral land. All central Jiangshi concerns and increasingly common contemporary experiences. Refugees and migrants face the exact spiritual anxieties Jiangshi folklore addressed. Where do you belong? Where should you be buried? How do you maintain cultural identity while physically displaced? The hopping corpse that can't find home becomes metaphor for diaspora experience. Information pollution parallels the key contamination concept. Just as Jiangshi drained and corrupted life energy, misinformation drains and corrupts cognitive resources. Exposure to bad information degrades your ability to think clearly, spreading from person to person through contact. The defenses are even similar. Maintain boundaries, information hygiene. Use protective measures. Critical thinking, fact-checking. Rely on specialists, trained journalists, scientists to identify and neutralize threats. The framework translates surprisingly well. Technological undeath presents another parallel. Digital legacies that persist after physical death. Social media accounts that continue posting through automation. AI trained on deceased people's data, creating simulations that move and speak after death. We're creating our own version of corpses that won't stay properly dead. Not physical bodies, but digital presences that outlive their creators. The anxiety is similar. Things that should end but don't. representations of the dead that disturb the living, unclear boundaries between what's truly gone and what persists. The Jiangshi asked, what happens when death doesn't finalize properly? Modern technology forces the same question through different means. Your grandmother's Facebook account keeps sending birthday reminders. Your dead friend's email appears in people you may know suggestions. Digital Jiangshi, hopping through algorithmic recommendations. Work exhaustion parallels, draining. Modern capitalism's extraction of energy, time, and vitality from workers mirrors the Jiangshi's life force consumption. You feel drained, exhausted, like something is sucking your vitality. Because something is. The Jiangshi at least had the courtesy to drain you quickly. Modern work culture extends the process over years. Slow-key depletion through overtime, workplace stress, insufficient rest. The mechanism differs, but the result, exhausted people barely alive, remains identical. These parallels aren't perfect. The Jiangshi emerged from specific historical conditions that don't map exactly onto contemporary situations. But the underlying patterns, disease anxiety, environmental consequences, economic inequality, displacement trauma, information corruption, technological persistence, exploitative extraction, remain remarkably consistent. The hopping corpse addressed fears that humans still experience. We just express them through different frameworks. But perhaps we could learn something from the folklore solutions. Community defense, specialist expertise, clear protective boundaries, addressing root causes rather than just treating symptoms. The Jiangshi might be culturally obsolete, but the problems it represented, those are still hopping toward us. Let's talk about what the Jiangshi teaches about cultural transmission and folklore evolution, because this monster's journey through time reveals how stories survive, adapt, and find new relevance. The Jiangshi passed through multiple transmission phases, each transforming it while maintaining core identity. Phase 1. Oral tradition during Qing Dynasty. Stories shared verbally, adapted regionally, serving practical functions in communities managing death and corpse transportation. The Jiangshi existed primarily as communal knowledge. Everyone knew the stories, the warnings, the protective measures. Phase 2. Written documentation in folklore collections. Scholars recorded the stories, freezing them in text, creating canonical versions. This preserved the folklore, but also killed some of its fluidity. Written Jiangshi became fixed, while oral Jiangshi had evolved with each retelling. Phase 3. Early 20th century decline. As modernization spread, younger generations dismissed the beliefs. The Jiangshi seemed destined for cultural extinction, remembered only in academic texts and elderly memories. Phase 4. Hong Kong cinema revival. The 1980s films resurrected the monster, transforming it from spiritual threat into pop culture icon. New audiences discovered the Jiangshi through entertainment rather than belief. Phase 5. Global spread through media. Video games, anime, internet content carried the Jiangshi worldwide. It became internationally recognizable, divorced from original cultural context, but maintaining visual distinctiveness. Phase 6. Internet age remix culture. Memes, fan art, online discussions created new iterations. The Jiangshi became participatory folklore. Anyone could create their own version, interpretation, or reference. Each phase transformed the monster. The Qing Dynasty villager, the 1980s Hong Kong filmmaker, and the 2020s internet user relate to the Jiangshi completely differently. Yet all recognize it as the same basic creature. The hopping movement, the Qing robes, the paper talisman. These elements persist through radical contextual changes. This demonstrates folklore's remarkable adaptability. Stories survive by transforming. What worked for corpse herders warning villages needed different form for cinema audiences seeking entertainment, needed different form again for internet users creating memes. But transformation requires maintaining some core identity. Change too much, and it's no longer the same folklore. Change too little, and it becomes irrelevant. The Jiangshi successfully balanced preservation and evolution. The visual distinctiveness helped. The hopping movement is unmistakable. You can't accidentally mistake it for something else. This strong visual identity allowed the Jiangshi to survive translation across media, languages, and cultures. Compare this to more abstract folklore that doesn't translate as clearly. Spirits without physical form or distinctive behaviors struggle to maintain identity through cultural transmission. The Jiangshi's physicality, awkward, grotesque, memorable, protected it. The humor helped too. The inherent absurdity of a hopping corpse made the folklore resilient through ironic appreciation. When literal belief faded, people could still engage with it through "this is ridiculous, but fun." The Jiangshi was funny enough to survive skepticism. Monsters that are only scary die when fear dies. Monsters that are funny alongside scary can survive as entertainment even when terror fades. The Jiangshi's tonal flexibility extended its cultural lifespan. The Hong Kong films understood this intuitively. They preserved traditional elements, proper Taoist rituals, correct talisman writing, accurate corpse herding procedures, while adding contemporary humor and spectacular action. Respect for source material combined with willingness to adapt. This approach created something genuinely new while maintaining connection to tradition. The films weren't pure preservation. That would be museum display, not living culture. They were active reinterpretation that kept the folklore breathing. Internet culture continues this process. Young people create Jiangshi fan art that mixes traditional elements with anime aesthetics, modern fashion, or contemporary social commentary. Each creation is technically wrong by traditional standards, but functionally right as folklore evolution. This participatory transformation is how folklore has always worked. Medieval villagers telling Jiangshi stories around fires added their own embellishments, local details, personal interpretations. Internet users creating Jiangshi content do exactly the same thing, just with digital tools instead of oral performance. The difference is speed and scale. Pre-modern folklore evolved slowly over generations. Internet folklore transforms weekly. But the underlying process, community members creatively engaging with shared stories, remains identical. What this suggests for cultural preservation, trying to freeze folklore in authentic historical form kills it. Folklore stays alive by changing. The goal isn't preservation like a butterfly pinned in a display case. It's cultivation like a garden that must adapt to new seasons while maintaining essential character. The Jiangshi succeeded because each generation found new relevance in the hopping corpse. Qing villagers saw practical death management. Hong Kong filmmakers saw action comedy potential. Internet users see meme template. All correct, all valid, all keeping the folklore alive. This offers hope for other endangered folklore. Stories survive through transformation. Communities maintain cultural identity not by perfect preservation, but by creative reinterpretation. The past stays alive by repeatedly becoming present. The Jiangshi's journey from mortuary practice to pop culture icon to internet phenomenon demonstrates folklore's remarkable resilience. Stories want to persist. They'll transform as necessary to find new audiences, new contexts, new relevance. The hopping corpse refuses to stay buried, not because anyone believes corpses actually hop, but because the image, the concept, the story remains useful, funny, frightening, meaningful, memorable. And as long as it serves any function, even just entertainment or cultural touchstone, it survives. Folklore doesn't die. It just changes clothes. The Jiangshi traded Qing robes for Hong Kong film costumes for internet aesthetics. But underneath, still hopping, still recognizable, still persistently stubbornly alive. As we come to the end of this journey into Chinese folklore, let's reflect on what the Jiangshi ultimately represents and why it matters beyond just being an interesting monster story. The Jiangshi is fundamentally a story about what happens when the transition from life to death fails properly, when bodies don't rest, when spiritual energy doesn't dissipate, when the living and dead remain entangled in ways they shouldn't be. Every culture grapples with this boundary between living and dead. We need death to be final because the alternative, that the dead might return, might need something from us, might threaten us, is psychologically intolerable. We bury, cremate, memorialize, and move on because we must. But uncertainty remains. Bodies look too much like the people they were. Death sometimes seems too sudden, too incomplete. The person was here, and now they're not, but the body remains, looking almost alive in the right light. This cognitive dissonance needs resolution. Folklore provides that resolution. The Jiangshi says, yes, sometimes the dead don't stay properly dead, and here's what to do about it. It acknowledges the anxiety while providing solutions, structured rituals, protective measures, specialist expertise. The fear becomes manageable through systematic response. Modern medicine and rationality address the same anxieties through different language. We understand decomposition, rigor mortis, the biological processes that transform living body into corpse. We have procedures for handling death. Laws, regulations, licensed professionals. Different framework, same function. But the Jiangshi taps into something deeper than biological fact. It expresses the feeling that death is wrong, unnatural, a violation of how things should be. That bodies moving when they shouldn't is fundamentally horrifying, regardless of rational explanation. This emotional truth persists even when literal belief fades. We know intellectually that corpses don't hop, but we still feel that something about death is deeply disturbing. The Jiangshi gives form to that feeling. The monster also reveals how communities organize around shared threats. The villages that developed Jiangshi defense protocols weren't irrational. They were sophisticated social systems managing real challenges: corpse transportation, disease prevention, death ritual maintenance, through culturally appropriate frameworks. Modern societies do exactly the same thing with different vocabulary. Public health protocols, emergency response systems, professional specializations for handling death and disease. The mechanisms change, but the need for organized community response remains constant. What made the Jiangshi particularly effective was combining individual responsibility, maintain your own protective measures, with community support. Everyone contributes to collective defense. Personal action mattered, but wasn't sufficient alone. You needed both individual vigilance and social cooperation. That balance is worth remembering. Modern individualism often suggests personal responsibility alone is sufficient. But the Jiangshi reminds us that some threats require collective response. Your rice bag protects you. Everyone's rice bags protect the community. The folklore also demonstrates the importance of specialist knowledge. Taoist priests weren't gatekeepers hoarding information. They were trained professionals with expertise developed over generations. Attempting to handle a Jiangshi without proper training was dangerous. Respecting expertise and supporting specialists was community survival strategy. Modern skepticism toward expertise sometimes forgets this. But specialized knowledge genuinely matters. Trying to handle complex problems without appropriate training endangers everyone. The Taoist priests understood this. Maybe we should too. The Jiangshi's persistence through cultural transformation shows that stories survive when they remain useful. The monster evolved from spiritual threat to pop culture icon because it continued serving functions: entertainment, cultural identity, symbolic language for discussing death and decay. This offers perspective on cultural preservation debates. Folklore doesn't need protection from change. It needs opportunity to transform. The Jiangshi stayed alive by becoming something new while maintaining core identity. That's not corruption. That's successful adaptation. The hopping corpse also reminds us that what seems absurd in one context can be meaningful in another. Modern audiences laugh at hopping movement, but that specific detail emerged from genuine observation of rigor mortis and practical challenges of corpse transportation. The silly element was actually grounded in reality. This suggests humility when encountering unfamiliar folklore. What seems ridiculous might encode practical knowledge or address genuine psychological needs. Every culture develops stories that sound strange to outsiders, but made perfect sense within original context. Finally, the Jiangshi teaches that fear can be useful when properly structured. Raw terror paralyzes, but fear channeled through systematic response. Know the signs, follow the procedures, maintain the defenses, call the specialists. Becomes productive. Modern societies sometimes try to eliminate fear entirely, treating it as irrational emotion to overcome. But fear serves evolutionary functions. The challenge isn't eliminating fear, but directing it toward appropriate responses. The villagers who feared Jiangshi weren't weak or ignorant. They were responding rationally to genuine dangers, disease, improper burial, corpse decay, through culturally available frameworks. The fear motivated useful behaviors. That's functional fear management. So what is the Jiangshi, really? It's a hopping corpse in Qing Dynasty robes with a paper talisman on its forehead, defeated by rice and peachwood, controlled by Taoist priests, emerging from improper burial, draining qi from the living. But it's also a sophisticated system for managing death anxiety, a community defense protocol, a preservation mechanism for practical knowledge, a cultural identity marker, a pop culture icon, a meme template, a story that refuses to die. It's ridiculous. It's meaningful. It's both simultaneously, just like most worthwhile folklore. And that's the story of the Jiangshi, one of the strangest, most distinctive monsters in global folklore. From Qing Dynasty corpse herders to Hong Kong cinema to internet culture, the hopping dead persists. It's a creature that should not work, a monster that hops, defeated by rice, controlled by paper talismans, blind but sensing breath, stiff from rigor mortis but relentlessly pursuing prey. And yet it does work. It's terrifying and absurd, grotesque and memorable, culturally specific and psychologically universal. It emerged from practical challenges. How do you transport corpses across long distances without refrigeration? And became something more, a symbol, a warning, a story that communities told to keep themselves safe. Whether Jiangshi literally existed doesn't particularly matter. People believed they did, organized entire social systems around that belief, developed sophisticated professional specializations to handle the threat. The belief was real enough to shape behavior, laws, economics, and culture for centuries. And the story persists, not because modern people fear hopping corpses, but because the image remains compelling, the concept remains interesting, and the cultural connection remains meaningful. The Jiangshi survives because folklore that serves functions survives. The functions changed from actual spiritual defense to entertainment to cultural identity marker, but usefulness persists. So here's your warning, the same warning Chinese villagers gave for centuries. Respect the dead, ensure proper burial, maintain protective boundaries, listen to specialists, support your community, and always keep rice nearby. Not because corpses will literally hop toward you, but because the wisdom embedded in the folklore, community cooperation, specialist expertise, systematic response to threats, respect for death and the dead, remains relevant. The Jiangshi teaches through terror and absurdity. It makes you laugh and makes you uncomfortable. It's pre-modern superstition and contemporary cultural icon. It's both wrong and right simultaneously. And on foggy nights, in the space between sleep and waking, when imagination activates and rational thought quiets, you might hear something. A rhythmic sound. Thud, thud. Something hopping, getting closer. You hold your breath, just like the story said, and you wait for it to pass. Because some lessons are better learned than tested. Sleep well, everyone. The Jiangshi is out there, but you have rice, you have knowledge, you have community. For now, that's enough. For now. Thank you for listening to this journey into Chinese folklore. If you made it this far, you've earned your rest. Remember, subscribe if you enjoyed this. Drop a comment about your own experiences with Chinese folklore or your thoughts on the Jiangshi, and let me know what monster you'd like to hear about next. Stay safe out there, respect the dead, and if you ever visit China and hear bells at night, stay inside. Close the windows, and whatever you do, don't look. The corpse herders might still be working.